Okay, so you guys are watching this exciting video, and I am somewhere in Ohio helping my dad celebrate his 80th birthday. So 80 is pretty old, so that's pretty cool. Let me remind you of your weekly question. Your weekly question is number 11. For the most part, white Southerners defended the peculiar institution, whether or not they had slaves, whether they were rich or poor, and whether they lived on large plantations or small farms. Why was this the case? My recommendation to you was, as always, textbook. So let me close this. I don't know why. So textbook, yeah, give me liberty. So if you look on page 410, and if you'll go through 410 to about 415, you could go a little earlier or later. But I would mention some things about how many people actually own slaves. I would mention some things about the percentage of slave owners and how many slaves they owned. There's a chart on 411 that talks about number of slaves owned by slave owners. There's a chart on the previous page that talks about numbers of slaves, and you'll see the number of slaves dramatically increased during that time period. And you'll also see a map on 414 that talks about the size of the slave holdings, the size of the plantations. What you'll notice also in the reading is a discussion of percentage of people who actually own slaves. And what you'll notice is most people in the South didn't own slaves. Most people who did own slaves didn't own very many slaves, and most slaves were owned by a very small percentage of people. But those people disproportionately controlled the politics and the economy of the South, which, as you already know, was based on cotton growth. And whether you grew cotton or processed cotton or shipped cotton or sold stuff to large plantations that grew cotton, you were probably somehow involved in the cotton economy of the South. Probably true. It is. All right, let me see if I can find those notes, and then we will talk about the remaining part of the chapter. Now, even though I'm not in Texas, which I know is strikingly sad, if you guys need something, if you send me an email, I will probably answer it, probably. So I'll check email in the evening. Excuse me. Also, when you watch the video, and I'll send a note about this as well, but when you watch the video, if you would please, I'm just going to ask you to make a comment that just says I watched the video or has your name in it. And if you can make sure that it's easy for me to figure out who you are. So if your username, I don't know if you have a username on YouTube, but if you make a comment on YouTube and it shows up like cool guy 1995 or something like that, I make sure that your name is in there somewhere. So I'll know that you watched the video. That's all. All right. So I think today we're talking about how to justify slavery, which was an easy thing to do if you owned a slave, because you wanted to justify it. And today's talk will sound a little bit like Sunday school, which I'm not allowed to teach very often. You'll see why here in a minute. Probably the way I would relay a Bible story wouldn't go over well with lots of kids. Well, really, their parents. Okay. But one of the things you know about religion, even at your age, you've experienced some religion, I'm sure, either by direct going to church, having religious family members, or meeting people who are religious, or perhaps you yourself are religious. But religion's a nice thing sometimes, and sometimes it's used to justify things that are not so nice, like owning slaves. So, not that you need to know, I sort of see the purpose of someone's faith as to help them become a better person, more like God or what they're worshiping, that sort of thing. Sometimes people use their religion to justify their current behavior. So you'll see that going on just a little bit during this time period, but you see it all the time, don't you? Okay. And I think the links in here are live. So if you want to look up some of those stories that are in the notes, yep, they are. So, oops, there we go. Yeah, the Time article goes to an article that says how Christian slave owners use the Bible to justify slavery. So, yep, that'll work on it. All right. I feel like I messed up the screen share. So, yeah, as many of these meetings as I've had, I still don't understand the technology. Here's what I do understand: history. So Southerners liked church as much as Northerners. And you'll notice that some denominations, most particularly Lutherans and Baptists, but others as well, split during this time period over slavery the same way Democrats will split over slavery, the same way lots of groups, the Whigs will split, well, the Democrats not as much, but the Whigs will split over slavery. The North and the South clearly split over slavery. But these churches, Baptist and Lutheran, also will split over slavery because you know, some of them thought the Bible justified it, others thought the Bible condemned it. All right, here are some Bible stories that were commonly used to justify slavery. So the idea of Cain and Abel, in one of the very first Bible stories, God creates Adam, and then he's lonely and probably can't find stuff because dudes can't find stuff. Um, and so he creates a woman so he'll be less lonely and can find stuff. And then they have some kids. I don't know how that happens. That's a whole different class. And a couple of their kids are Cain and Abel. And Old Testament stuff, if you want to get right with God, you got to sacrifice something. Could be like a little dove, or it could be a goat, or maybe it's some grain, or yeah, a bowl of stew or something. So Cain and Abel, and I always get it backwards. One of them's a shepherd, one of them grows stuff. Abel makes a sacrifice, and God goes, "Thanks, Abel. That's pretty cool. You're forgiven. Good job." And then Cain makes a sacrifice, and God says, "No, Cain, you gave me like the spotted goat, or you know, whatever it was that it wasn't pure, it wasn't a good sacrifice, it wasn't the best of what he had." So God says, "No go. That's not cool. Cain, don't be cheap. Give me something good." And so Cain gets mad because God liked Abel's sacrifice more than Cain's. So Cain just kills Abel, you know. And so then God goes up to Cain and says, like, "Hey, where's Abel?" And he goes like, "Man, I don't know. Am I supposed to keep track of him or something?" And then God says, "Yeah, you're supposed to be your brother's keeper. Plus I'm God, so I know you killed him and you're going to be punished for that." Okay. So now I'm going to tell you ahead of time that I think all of this is terrible theology. And I don't know anyone alive that agrees with any of this interpretation of any of this stuff at the moment. However, so what some people thought during that time period was that God curses Cain. And Cain says, "Oh, my curse is too much. I can't bear it. Plus, if people find out you cursed me, they're going to try to kill me." And so God says, "No, they're not going to try to kill you. I'm going to give you a mark that says, 'Don't kill Cain.'" And so some people believe the curse of Cain is that God made him black and that he would, yeah. So, oops. Okay. All right, but then you go on, well, wasn't there some story about a flood and all those people disappeared anyway, and then we started over? It's like, yes, there was, but yeah, conveniently, our Southern friends will have a Bible story that will take care of this as well. Their story is about Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and those guys were Noah's sons. So you're up on the Noah story. God got mad because people kind of craven and corrupt and nasty and stuff. And God said, "You know what? I'm sick of these people. I wish I never made them. And I'm going to start over." But Noah, that dude, I like Noah. So we'll keep Noah. The rest of them have to go. And even the animals, they're not cool either. So God sends a giant flood, which kills everyone. But God tells Noah several years ahead of time and says, like, "Hey, build a boat. There's going to be a flood." And I guess there'd never been a flood before. And so it's like, "What's a flood?" And so he explains, it's like, "All right, you're God, I'll build the boat." So he builds a giant boat. They have a replica of one in one of those nice states like Kentucky or Tennessee if you want to go visit it in the United States. But the ark really apparently wouldn't have been built in the United States. But anyway, so there's a giant ark, and there's 2 of some animals and 7 of other animals. The ones you sacrifice, there's extras of those. And I guess the birds and fish were just on their own. But anyway, so God lets Noah, his wife, 3 sons, their wives, and a bunch of animals survive the flood. So they're floating around on the boat. The water is receding, and then their boat hits something. So they get off the boat and they go do their thing. And Noah, I guess, plants some grapes or finds some grapes or something, makes a nice beverage, which ferments, and then he gets drunk, because I'm sure no one ever got drunk, even, in biblical days. So Noah's drunk, and then his son Japheth, Ham and Shem are looking for him. It's like, where the heck's dad? Why can't we find him? So Ham goes into the tent, and Noah is drunk, and he's passed out, and he doesn't have any clothes on. So Ham just starts laughing like, Dad's drunk and naked. So he goes out and tells Shem and Japheth, Dad's drunk and naked. And then Shem and Japheth go, oh my, Dad is drunk and naked. What can we do to preserve his dignity? So they apparently walking backwards, drop a blanket on him or something. And then he wakes up and goes, oh man, I'm drunk and naked. I wonder what happened. Well, in their tradition, when the dad gets older and thinks he's not going to live much longer, he pronounces a blessing or a curse on his children. Wouldn't that be nice to get the curse from the kid or from the dad? But what he does is he says that Ham, because of how he behaved, will be the servant of his brothers. And traditionally, they went to different parts of the ancient world to populate. And so the tradition was that Ham, who will be the servant of his brothers forever throughout history, ends up going, yes, to Africa. Okay, I'm just saying. All right, other ways that they justify slavery. Abraham owned a lot of slaves, as you may be aware if you've read Old Testament stuff. But then you're thinking, well, don't Christians really like the New Testament? It's like, yeah, they do. But Jesus never condemned slavery. And the Apostle Paul, in several epistles or the letters that he writes to churches during his time period, says, hey, be nice to your slaves the way that God's nice to you and you serve God. So if your slave serves you, you should be nice to him. And he tells slaves to be nice to their masters because they serve God, so it's okay for them to serve their masters, and maybe they can help their master understand who God is if they serve him well. It's like, that doesn't sound like a condemnation of slavery, but I don't know that that's a justification of it either. It's just an acknowledgement. So other people are going to read the Bible and think, do unto others as you would have them do unto you means don't own people, which, in the modern era is probably the way we would interpret the New Testament towards slavery. But the point of all this, and the book talks about some stories, and the Time in Christianity Today articles can talk about more, or do talk about more. They mention that slavery did happen in the Old and New Testament, that it's not outwardly condemned, that there are guys like, who was it? Joseph, that's a slave that ends up saving all of Israel, and that slavery is not uncommon. So why would we end it now? And mostly, the other side will go, because it's wrong. That's why we'd end it now. Also, one of the things that the book will talk about when it talks about slave life, plantation religion, is when slaves mix whatever religious traditions they had with Christianity, which is very, very common for any group of folks that convert to Christianity. One of the stories that they really latch onto in slave sermons is Egypt and Israel, where Israel is enslaved by Egypt, but eventually God will deliver Israel. So when they talk about Harriet Tubman as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, she'll be referred to from time to time as Moses, because she's leading people to freedom. So The Egypt-Israel story does get repeated a lot in slave churches, okay, and songs and spirituals and that sort of thing. Um, but when people who are justifying slavery say, Israel was enslaved, I don't know that that means they're comparing their slaves or saying that their slaves are really God's chosen people. Western white people, in their view of things, were the modern God's chosen people. And you'll see that a lot with the ideas of manifest destiny. And people will believe that's why it was so easy. Not everybody, but certainly people who thought it was convenient, and maybe people who truly believed it as well. We'll talk about how God really delivers the land into the hands of Americans, because he wants them to have it. It's very easy for people who colonize the United States, what becomes the United States, to take it over. Therefore, it must have been God's will. Slaves are going to embrace Bible stories of freedom and retribution, like Israel escaping slavery in Egypt, David defeating Goliath, Samson defeating the Philistines. Now, Samson does die in the process, but a lot more Philistines die. Daniel being delivered in the lion's den, and just the idea that, and this is very common in spirituals and sermons from plantations, the idea that maybe this life is not great, but your reward in eternity will be. And it could also be that the slave owner may not get his punishment in life on earth, but his punishment will be eternal. So Bible is used to justify slavery, but it's also used to talk about how slavery is wrong and how slavery needs to be changed. All right, some other stuff that we want to talk about briefly. Pardon me. Slave rebellion and resistance. So the book's going to talk about how day-to-day resistance, silent sabotage is pretty common stuff. Part of the reason that you see this happen more often is because it's safer. Yeah. So if you ever wonder, especially in states like Virginia or South Carolina, I think at a certain point, maybe Louisiana was this way as well, but states where the number of slaves is larger than the number in the white population, and certainly on a plantation, there are more slaves than there are white people. And you're thinking to yourself, there's more, why don't they just overthrow the master or kill people and leave? They don't have weapons. That's it. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. I know you guys aren't old enough to remember when South Africa was segregated. That was certainly a thing when I was your age. And South Africa, for at least a century, had been controlled by the English and the Dutch, white leaders, and the majority of the population, vast majority, were Black. But because the other part of the population had an army that supported them, an armed rebellion wasn't going to be terribly successful unless you're all willing, to die. So most people want freedom. They just maybe don't want eternal freedom right away. So day-to-day resistance is really more what you see as far as rebellion and resistance. So it might be that when your overseer isn't there, you don't work as hard, or it might be that if you're working in the part of the plantation that grows food, that you take some food for yourself, or maybe you're the cook and you poison some food, or you poison the water supply. Not the entire water supply, clearly, but the water supply that is used by the people who live in the main house. So day-to-day resistance, maybe you break machinery. There's lots of things. It's typically slow down, not work as hard, occasionally break machinery. That sort of thing is what you saw. This is more subtle. It's harder to trace, so therefore it's harder to punish. As far as running away is tricky because got to have some resources to be successful at running away, and you have to have a destination where you'll be received. And also the punishment there are two pretty standard punishments that will be threatened all the time to slaves. Punishment number one, we will harm your family. So people who run away typically are younger, and they are usually men. They're usually men because, as we talked about in the first part of the chapter, like with women like Celia was 12 or 13 when she was raped by some part of the slave owner's family. And that happened really early to the female slaves because they wanted the female slaves to give birth and have more children. Therefore, the owner would have more slaves. So female slaves were usually became mothers, usually due to rape, at a very early age. So it's almost always young men who are trying to escape. So, and it's young men who aren't attached to a family anymore, so that they're not going to harm their parents, or they don't have a wife and a child on the plantation. So that way they can just escape and no one is in danger. The other punishment would be if you got caught, then they would sell you down the river. And the book talks pretty extensively, I think it's in the next chapter, where they talk about the upper South versus the northern, upper South and the lower South, and how the second cash crop from the upper South really is selling slaves to the lower South. Yeah. The book also talks quite a bit about, in addition to slave culture, what slave labor is like. And during production season, well, almost all year round, your work is from sunup to sundown. Most people are working on plantations because that's where most slaves lived. I think the book says, let's see, 75% of women, 90% of men worked in the fields. Sometimes smaller farms. The owner would work with the slaves, and then sometimes they talk about gang labor, which is large groups of people working together, and those are usually in the sugar plantations, which there are not very many of in the United States, but almost all of them are in Louisiana. And they talk a little, and rice as well, rice plantations, South Carolina and Georgia. Sometimes this is more about task labor. Sugar fields, it's really, I think the workload is larger, but with the rice plantations, the idea is once your task is over, then you have some sort of free time. Orders maintained by threat, of course, and by pushing religion quite a bit on to plantations. And the idea behind the religion that the slave owners will emphasize is the idea of obedience. So they talk a lot about the parts of the Bible that tell you need to be obedient. That's the main theme of slave sermons when slave owners are in charge of who's preaching the sermon. Yeah, okay. As far as escaping, you do see the Underground Railroad develop during this time period. And the Underground Railroad eventually, let's see, and Harriet Tubman being the largest or most famous purveyor of the Underground Railroad, probably, let's see, 30,000 folks probably escaped from the South to the North in the 30 years before the Civil War. Well, that's a large number. There are about 4 million slaves during that time period, so it's not, a large percentage. Frederick Douglass will escape slavery this way, but he will end up buying some freedom papers and just riding in a carriage to the North. But he's hiding, of course. He's not like sitting there like, bye, but he's hiding. People, when they wanted to escape, Canada is a good escape, but also Mexico is a possibility. And Florida. And you're wondering, like, why Florida? Um, People would go to where the Seminole tribes lived in the Everglades. The Seminole are the only Native American tribe to ever really officially win a war against the United States and get to keep their land. So it's very common for escaped slaves in the Southeast to go to Florida and blend in with the Seminole tribe. It's also why I'm sure you guys look at tribal roll pictures all the time. There are odd reasons that I do that. I mean, in part because I'm a history teacher, but also in part because of where I'm from in Joplin, Missouri, is right next to Oklahoma. So if you're from there and you're poor-ish, you know, you have a relative somewhere who lives on a plantation, or that who, excuse me, who lived on a reservation. So I had a great grandmother who lived on a reservation and was a full Cherokee, but apparently my great grandfather thought she was pretty cute and went over and they had some kids. Um, so, you know, occasionally I look at tribal roll lists and pictures and stuff because of family stuff. But if you look at the Seminole pictures, if you look at tribal pictures, you will notice there are lots of people who appear to be African American, and that's because that's where a lot of escaped slaves went. All right, so if you live in the upper South, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, you're probably going to Canada or certain more friendly states in the north, Massachusetts, Illinois, maybe Ohio, kind of depends. If you live in New Orleans, or if you live in the Deep South, cities like New Orleans and Charleston are possible places to run away because they had large free Black or mixed race populations. And if you're in the Southeast, the Everglades, and you could go to Mexico as well. And the book talks about how the US government is going to demand that Mexico and Canada return slaves, which they probably won't do very much. Okay. Other stuff that's kind of interesting as the chapter concludes. I assume that you understand about the Underground Railroad, that there's not actually a railroad, but it's a path to freedom, and it usually ends up in Canada. And that there are, I know I told you for spring break, I went to a quilt museum in LaGrange with my college roommate. I have no idea why, but she likes quilting and LaGrange. So we went there. But somebody there was talking about how families would hang out different quilts on their clotheslines to explain, like, if their house was available for runaway slaves or if it wasn't. So they had quilt codes, which I really didn't know about. And the people at the Quilt Museum were very disappointed when they found out I was a history teacher and didn't know about quilt codes. So, and apparently that's a really common thing for your elementary school teacher to tell you during her US history class. So I had no idea. So sorry for disappointing you. But Underground Railroad, you had lots of Quakers and lots of Congregationalist leftover Puritans who were helpful on that, and just lots of folks from the North who thought slavery was bad. So they helped people escape, and you tended to travel at night, sleep during the day in somebody's basement, that kind of thing, and then travel a couple of days later. So Underground Railroad, you might ride in a wagon at night. You might walk through forest, that kind of stuff, but you did your traveling at night typically. Your goal is to get to the north, to Canada. You could be like Frederick Douglass and eventually send money to your former master to pay for yourself, because Frederick Douglass is kind of a boss like that. But most people didn't do that. They just escaped. Okay. There were some open rebellions, Gabriel's Rebellion, Gabriel Prosser's Rebellion in 1800 in Virginia, which the book has already talked about, and Denmark Vesey Conspiracy in South Carolina. Neither of these produced lots of success, I guess, in any traditional way. I suppose the most successful slave revolt, and you can read about these on 436 through about 438. The most successful revolt, and the one that we tend to talk about the most in US history, is Nat Turner's Rebellion, because it's the last large-scale rebellion. It's probably more successful than other rebellions because it starts off with a handful of folks and then eventually goes from the deal was they were going to go from plantation to plantation and they were going to kill slave owners and their families. Nat Turner was a preacher who also could read and write, organized a rebellion, and the rebellion was not, he wanted to start the rebellion on July 4th for obvious reasons, ended up doing it in August, and many of their victims were women and children, which people thought was pretty heinous. Frederick Douglass will write about that. It's like, it's okay for bad things to happen to Black women and children, but white women and children, innocent victims, but Black women and children are not. They don't escape, but they do kill dozens of people in the process of trying to escape. So it's seen as a successful rebellion for the era, but what happens after that is, I'm looking to see if it tells you, let's see. Nat Turner's captured, 17 folks executed. Let's see, militia put down the uprising, 80 slaves had joined Nat Turner, 60 whites had been killed. So it's a pretty large episode, but they're executed. Turner's going to say, well, Jesus was also crucified, so I don't see this as a bad end. But you'll end up seeing really no more armed rebellion after that because slave codes changed dramatically where slaves are no longer allowed to go from plantation to plantation. There's a real limit placed on allowing slaves to have any sort of education, allowing them to become preachers, allowing them to have visitors who are not slaves, that sort of thing. So, because Nat Turner was, let's see, I think that he had been a slave but was freed and was sure that God had called him to lead this rebellion. So they really didn't want any more preachers like Nat Turner after that. And slavery, I'm sorry, excuse me. Slave rebellions are pretty rare because there's just not a good chance that they're going to be successful. All right, before I go, and I know it's much shorter than our normal class, but I figured you're good and we can talk more next week. So be sure to read through the book. I know you guys don't always do that, but I think that the book really gives you the background you need to give better explanations in your answers, because a lot of times your answers look to me like a fact list rather than connecting the stuff. Reading the book will help you connect the stuff. And the book also adds a lot of stuff that I didn't talk about, where it talks about slave family and family roles, that sort of stuff. And as you can imagine, if you're in a situation where you don't control if you get to stay where you want to stay, you know, someone can sell you to another plantation, your family structure is going to be disrupted a lot. So family is just kind of whoever decides to be family from time to time. And then if somebody gets sold away and moves to another plantation, it's not that they don't want to keep the connection with their own family or their original family. It's just they may not have the option of doing that. And the book will also talk about how, well, maybe there's a code of or cult of domesticity during that time period. It clearly doesn't apply to Black women who are going to be field slaves as well. Probably the most famous female field slave was Sojourner Truth, and she does the Aren't I or Ain't I a Woman poem where she talks about how she can work as hard and eat as much as a man. She probably could. She was really big. She was over 6 feet tall. She's an unusual woman of stature for that era, quite literally. All right, I feel like I'm going to stop talking about this. We probably will talk more about Frederick Douglass in a future lecture as well, because I just don't think you can talk enough about Frederick Douglass. But weekly question, send me an email if you have a question. Those of you who like to send the weekly question so that I can look it over and tell you if it's good or bad, you better do that early. I got a couple of those on like Thursday at midnight or Friday in the morning. And because of Easter and some other stuff, last week I wasn't able to do it. And I may be busy this week as well. So if you want feedback, probably try to send it before Thursday at midnight, okay? All right, I hope you guys are well. I hope you enjoyed the STAR test. If you had to take that, those are always fun. It's one of the things I really miss about teaching high school. But take care of yourselves, be safe, have a good weekend. Send me an email if you have a question or concern. All right, thank you, bye.